Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm going to talk today about three of the basic elements that we use at our show to build stories. And those elements are action, reflection, and stakes. All right, so we're going to start with action. I want to try and tell you the most boring story I can think of right now, okay? Last Sunday, I went to the airport. I handed the attendant my ticket and walked on board the plane. I stowed my luggage, and then I sat down, and then I heard the engine start running. All right, it's like totally boring, right? Nothing actually happens in that story at all whatsoever. But do you notice that there's still a motion to it? There's one thing occurring, then another thing. When we hear motion like that, we're wired to tune in. Our ears perk up because we assume that that motion is going to take us somewhere. We assume that there's going to be payoff at the end. So take, for example, this story. This is a story about a guy named Joel. Joel worked at this office where every now and then the office manager would bring his 9-year-old daughter to work. She was a good kid, kind of tomboyish.
And she would just kind of help out around the office. She would pass mail out. And over the time that I was there, she and I developed this kind of teasing relationship. She would come into my office and she would drop my mail off and stick her tongue out at me, and I would sort of fake chase her down the hallway or something. And, you know.
That's sweet.
Yeah, she's an incredibly sweet kid. And so there's this day when it's early in the morning. I've arrived at the office, and I go into the bathroom. And when I come out of the bathroom, I have my glasses in my shirt pocket rather than on my head. And I look down this hallway and I see this small person walking towards me. And I then get down and start to crab walk towards her. So I sort of go down on my haunches and put my hands up as if they're claws and kind of waddle towards her.
So just at this point, no one's turning the radio off right now, okay?
And as I'm waddling towards her, I say in this kind of creepy voice, "Oh no, I can't believe you're here today." And then at that moment, as I say, "today," she comes into focus. And I realize, in fact, it's not at all the young girl who I thought it was, but it's in fact one of our interns, a business intern who is a midget. And so she comes into focus, and I see her, and I'm horrified, and I go bolt upright, and I stand up, and I say, "Oh my God, I'm terribly sorry. I thought you were somebody else." And I think to myself, who could she possibly think that somebody else is? And I wonder at the time, should I have tried to explain it to her? And it seems to me like one of those situations where it only gets worse the more you try to explain it. The only thing I could do is, in fact, apologize and then end all contact with her forever right there.
All right, so you guys recognize the format? It's the exact same format as my stupid little airplane story, only interesting, right? There's action. He comes out of the bathroom. He's got his glasses in his pocket. Action. He notices a small person down the hallway. Action. He gets on the ground and crawls towards the person. Action. He realizes, oh, this person is not who I thought this person was, right? It's very simple. Motion. It pulls you forward. But did you notice? So the last piece of action in the story is him realizing it's not the person he thought it was, right? That's the actual last thing that happens. But still, the story goes on from there. I'm just going to play you the end again.
And I think to myself, who could she possibly think that somebody else is? And I wonder at the time, should I have tried to explain it to her? And it seems to me like one of those situations where it only gets worse the more you try to explain it.
So that's element number 2. That is reflection, all right? And that's really important because that's the moment in the story where we get inside the person's head, where we get to know what they're feeling, where we get to know what they're thinking, where they become a real human experiencing this, and they say something about it that we can relate to. So at that line where he makes the point about, like, it's one of those situations where the more you say, like, the worse it's going to get, that's the line that makes this a story. It takes it from being a story where maybe Joel would tell it to his friends and they would find it funny because they know Joel, to a story that he can tell a whole audience and the whole audience can find it funny, because we can all relate to that experience, right? We've all been in that experience where, the more we say, just the worse it is going to get. And that's what makes it a story worth telling on the radio and telling to a larger audience. So reflection is really important as well. And then stakes. So this is something I think a lot of people don't totally get all the time. So I'm going to play you the very beginning of an hour-long show we did recently. Back in October, a group of us on staff spent the whole month at a car dealership outside of New York City. This is the very beginning of that hour-long show.
Freddie is the general manager of a car dealership these days, but he used to be a car salesman, and he was a good one, partly because he's got what he calls the gift for the gab. His go-to move in lots of situations is to finish a sentence and then laugh, even when the sentence is bad news. Like, here he is, assessing his chances of making his sales goal for the month.
I'll give it a 50-50 right now because it's early.
Or this is him talking about a month when the car dealership did not make its sales goal.
And I'm strictly commission, so I make nothing.
So when Freddie is not laughing, you know it's bad. And this October, Freddie did not laugh much at his weekly meetings with the guys who sell cars for him.
All right, so you may think that's just like all fun and games, a bunch of shenanigans, dude laughs at the end of his sentences, right? That is actually integral to the story. The story could not happen without those two sentences because they contain the stakes. I'm going to play it again. Listen closely.
Here he is, assessing his chances of making his sales goal for the month.
I'll give it a 50-50 right now because it's early.
Or this is him talking about a month when the car dealership did not make its sales goal.
And I'm strictly commission, so I make nothing.
So in those sentences where he's at the end of each line, you're learning two very important pieces of narrative information. You're learning that there's a 50-50 chance that they're going to make their sales goal at the end of the month. And then you're also learning that if they don't make their sales goal, Freddie's not getting any money. So there's a lot at stake. There's a question raised right in the beginning. It's the 16 seconds at the very beginning of the show. And so basically the situation was, for the month that we were there in October, the sales team had to sell 129 new cars. If they did that, they would make $90,000. If they sold one short, if they sold 128 cars, they made $0. And this is a little more of that story. We're going to pick up where Freddie's at a weekly meeting with his sales team, telling them they've got to get their act together.
I'm stressing.
Sorry.
Dude, get on higher gear. This is no joke. I gotta be at that number. Or I'm telling you, not gonna be a nice guy. So put your nose right to the ground and come out shooting today. Everybody. I want balloons in all the departments. I want the radios down on. Put the convertible tops down all over the place. I want tons of balloons in the showroom. I just don't want one balloon to a car. Balloon the whole freaking place so it looks like a circus. Make it seem like we're having a monster sale and it's a party. Because we got to be at the big number by the 31st midnight. Period. No ands, ifs, and buts.
So everybody grabs balloons. Grown men inflate and tie and decorate. It's a truism in their business. Balloons sell cars. And then nobody shows up. For an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. Saturday should be one of their busiest days, and it's empty.
Hey, Freddie, how's it going today so far?
Shit. Really bad. Really slow. Really, really slow.
Early afternoon, Freddie told one of our producers, Brian Reed, that it was way slower than usual. I don't know if you can catch this, but try to notice the song that is playing over the radio in the background as they talk.
What do you think it is? What's going on?
Not a clue. I'm stressing. Oh, I'm stressing.
Here's a little song I wrote. You might want to sing it note for note. Don't worry. Be happy.
So, you guys hear did you kind of notice how the stakes really drive that story? There's this question, are they going to make their quota? Are they going to make their money? And it keeps you invested. It's incredibly necessary. You can't do the story without it. Without it, it would just be like a profile of these guys with funny accents. if you think about whatever book you're reading right now, or whatever TV show you're really into, I guarantee that there are stakes. If you think about it, you can identify. There's some question that's driving the story forward. You know, is the couple going to get together? Are the gangsters going to like pull off the heist, or are they going to get caught? There's some question that keeps you listening. And I think like when people come to us with ideas, this is often one of the things that's missing from the ideas they bring us. They'll come and say, oh, you know, I met this really fascinating guy. He's like a war veteran, or he's traveled the world, and he has such fascinating stories. He's had such an interesting life. He's a funny guy. He'd be a great story. And actually, it probably wouldn't be a great story, because what you'd end up with is a descriptive profile of an interesting person. But if you can't identify the stakes, if you can't identify the question, there's no mechanics to make the story go. There's no narrative momentum there. And so it's incredibly important. So action, reflection, and stakes. I want to play one last excerpt. It's an example of, I think, of how powerful all these elements can be when you put them together. This is from an hour-long story I produced about a guy named Oscar Ramirez. Oscar grew up in Guatemala, moved to the U.S. He'd been there about a dozen years when he got a phone call from a war crimes prosecutor back in Guatemala. She told him that when he was 3 years old, soldiers murdered everyone in a tiny town called Dos Aires. This was back in the 1980s, so decades earlier. She said they'd murdered everybody except for 2 little boys. And she thought that he was one of those 2 little boys. Oscar says that he was sure she had the wrong person. He'd never heard of this town, and he'd had a happy childhood.
I was like confused. I didn't know what she was talking about. But she said, I know you don't know much about it, or you probably don't know anything about it. Because I was quiet. I was just listening to what she's saying.
So they do a DNA test, and sure enough, the man that Oscar thought was his father was not his father, but in fact was a commander of the army squad that killed Oscar's whole family and 200 people, his whole village. The commander then kidnapped Oscar and raised him as his own. And as if that weren't enough news to get in your 30s, there was more. Oscar's real father, his biological father, was alive. He happened to be out of town the day of the massacre, and they found him living in the jungle for all those years.
Mi nombre es Tranquilino Castañeda Valenzuela.
My name is Tranquilino Castañeda Valenzuela.
So that is, this is Oscar's biological father, Tranquilino, and here's a bit more from that story.
Tranquilino's pregnant wife was killed at Dos Aires, along with all of his children, 9 of them, or so he thought. For 30 years, he's lived alone in the jungle. He never remarried after the massacre, never had another child. And in the middle of our interview, Tranquilino interrupted with a request.
Ahora puedo el nombre de los hijos también.
Can I give the name of my children?
Of course.
Esther Castañeda.
My firstborn was Esther Castañeda.
Etelvina.
Second one was Etelvina.
Enma.
Enma was the third.
De ahí estaba Maribel.
After that was Maribel.
Esther tenía 13 años
She
cuando
was
murió.
around 13 when she died.
Uno se llamaba Luz Antonio. De los mismos apellidos.
Then it was Luz Antonio, part of my sons.
De ahí estaba César.
Then it was Cesar.
César tenía 7.
Cesar was 7 years old.
Y de ahí vinieron otras 2 hembritas.
Then 2 other girls,
Odilia,
Odilia
Rosalba.
and Rosalba.
Anyone else?
Sí, Alfredo.
Alfredo was Oscar's given name. Tranquilino was out of town when Dos Aires happened, visiting relatives. When he learned about the massacre, that everyone, including his wife and kids, had been killed,
Yo me estuve de una vez el pensamiento.
Well, I got all crazy.
Mire, mi situación es grande.
Listen, I started to drink.
Yo pensé ahogar las penas y que si podían nadar.
I thought I could drown all my sorrows. But then I figured out that my sorrows could swim.
So that clip illustrates the last feature of successful stories that I want to share today. And that is every story should speak to something larger than itself. That heartbreaking final line from Tranquilino, I thought I could drown all my sorrows, but then I figured out that my sorrows could swim. That comes from him having lived this totally unique, horrible experience. But still, that only he could have that insight, you know? But still, that insight is a universal insight. So now when I read the newspaper about Iraq or Syria or other places in the world where people are experiencing terrible pain and loss, stories that I think actually can be too easy to ignore because they're so horrible and unfixable and constant, I think back to Tranquilino, and it helps me understand those events in a deeper, more empathetic way. A good story should always do that too. It should make a larger point about human experience and about the world. Thanks.